Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Krystal Lynn Couture, and today we'll be talking about the pelvic floor and menstruation. But first, I want to take a moment to extend my abundant gratitude to the AAC, the American Acupuncture Council, for hosting this educational video, as well as other amazing videos that are on their vlog. Seriously, check it out. There are tons of clinical pearls and nuggets of wisdom on all topics acupuncture and Chinese medicine. So let's get started with today's topic, the pelvic floor and menstruation. In today's mini workshop, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of menstruation and how it was viewed through society. We'll talk about some Chinese medicine philosophy, including what the Su Wen says about menstruation. We'll talk about the elemental cycles as well as the hormones. We'll also talk very briefly about some of the common dysfunctions that are associated with menstruation, such as dysmenorrhea or painful menstruation, irregular cycles, menorrhagia, which is heavy bleeding, or amenorrhea, which is the absence of the menstrual cycle. We'll also chat about the connection to the pelvic floor throughout the menstrual cycle. Let's get into it. So let's look at the Western history first. And there are some pretty interesting things to note here. In ancient Greece and Rome, in antiquity, menstruation was often viewed with a mix of awe and fear. The ancient Greek physicians, like Hippocrates, described menstruation as a natural process, but it was surrounded by a variety of superstitions. As we moved into the medieval period, menstruation was actually framed within religious and moral contexts, and the women's menstrual cycles were actually associated with sin or divine punishment. Now, moving into the 19th and early 20th century, this was our first sort of win, if we can call it that. Menstruation was actually considered a biological process and given a scientific definition. And this was basic in that the blood and mucosal tissue flowed once monthly throughout the vaginal opening. Now, as we move into the 1960s and 1970s, okay, so this is really, really recent. Women have been bleeding since the beginning of time, and yet it was the 1960s and 70s when feminists began to challenge the stigma that surrounded menstruation. And there was an increased awareness of the impact that menstruation can have on a woman's social and professional life. Finally, in the state of present feminism, the world has recently started talking about menstruation. Amazing! And there are some really big voices out there in both Western and Chinese medicine that are setting the stage for women to learn about their bodies, to talk about menstruation, and to honor their cycles. Now, as a woman, this feels huge, because there are so many questions that I feel women have regarding menstruation. And growing up in the 80s and the 90s, as a child during that time, I didn't ask questions. I wondered what was happening in my body, but it didn't seem like there was an opportunity to ask those questions. I didn't feel like there was a stigma, but there wasn't an opportunity either. And I think a lot of women feel that way. And a lot of women continue to feel that way. So as acupuncturists, we've got this beautiful opportunity to help clients understand their bodies, to help them honor their monthly bleed, to help them gain some knowledge about what's happening within their biological system, within their ecosystem, so that they can then, one, get help when they need it, two, identify when something doesn't feel right, and three, feel like what's happening is okay and it's normal and there shouldn't be shame and other negative emotions associated with it. I love this quote from Christiane Northrup, an MD. She says the macrocosm cycles of nature, such as the ebb and flow of the tides and the changes of seasons, are reflected on a smaller scale within the menstrual cycle. I think if we can instill one connection for our clients that are coming to see us for menstrual support, it's that the menstrual cycle is natural. And it is called a cycle for a reason. It is not a stable process within the body. The hormones are changing throughout that cycle. And it is okay to feel differently throughout the month. It's okay that we might have more energy at some times and a little bit less energy at other times. And that our output and our input might be gauged differently depending on what's happening in our cycle, in our own unique ways of processing that. And again, as acupuncturists, if we can support our clients to feel into the cycles, to understand that just like the seasons outside change, the season in our body is changing on a monthly basis. And that's okay. That's brilliant. In fact, that's an opportunity, not a negative subset. So the Su Wen, 2 times 7, the age of 14. The dew of heaven rises. The Ren channel begins to flow, and the Chang is flourishing. Menstruation comes regularly, and one can conceive. In Chinese philosophy, when we're talking about menstruation, I want to try to bridge the gap here a little bit between the tangible of what's happening from a Western perspective and the more ethereal that's happening from an Eastern perspective, or ethereal emotional. So during phase 1, we'll call that menstruation, the bleed. This is usually days 1 to 4. Most of the hormones are going to drop off during this time. And of course, this is when the uterine lining is shedding if one does not become pregnant. The uterus is cleansing out the old blood. In Chinese medicine philosophy, this is the time to regulate the flow of the blood and qi. So that means that because so much is happening in the body, we don't want to put a lot of demands on the body. We want to encourage our clients to eat easily digestible, protein-rich foods like soups and stews with iron in them as well that are going to help them to continue to regulate that flow and also build the blood throughout the cycle. We want to prevent stagnation of blood, which can come in the form of endometriosis, and excessive bleeding, which of course that can be our depletion, right? So during this time, I like to encourage clients to conserve their qi. I encourage them to rest during this time. If they're going to do exercise, to be doing exercise that is low impact, like yoga or meditation or qigong. This is not the time to encourage your client to be going for, their strongest pump or something like that. Because the body wants to utilize that energy. And as acupuncturists, we know there's only a certain amount of energy to go around the body, right? And at certain times, like menstruation, that energy is concentrated in the uterus, which is why we feel a little bit more fatigued, which is why we feel a little bit more depleted. The uterus is taking all of that energy to release the uterine lining, to let go, to shed. So when we start to shunt that energy in other places, what we can have is then the uterus not having the energy it needs. So resting, staying warm, gentle exercise, avoiding sex during menstruation is really important because the process of the bleed is a downward and outward process, right? It is a releasing process. Taking in during a releasing process sort of goes against, in Chinese medicine philosophy, what is naturally occurring in the body. And that's the key, helping our clients just to tap into the logic of what is their body saying and using the simple cues of how their body responds to then make choices. avoiding heavy lifting, of course, and hydrating well. This is one of my big tips for clients, is to encourage them to stay maximally hydrated. The blood, in essence, right, is water. It has that capacity to it. So we want to keep the fluids in the body flowing. We want to keep the digestive tract flowing. We don't want this to be a time when things are bound up. Let's talk about phase 2, the follicular phase. So this is going to be approximately days 5 to 11. During this time, this is going to be when FSH is secreted, follicle stimulating hormone. Follicles develop during this phase, and estrogen is secreted from the follicles. There's the activation of the egg, and the endometrium thickens. The Chinese medicine philosophy here is that it's time to nourish the blood and nourish the yin. We also want, for fertility's sake, we also really want to be strengthening that uterine lining and the follicles, which means that a diet should include proteins, it should include leafy greens, and it also should include foods that are moistening, okay? So sweet potatoes are a great example of a food that is moistening. During this time, we want energy to be contained, but we can have output. So that means we can start to move our bodies more. We can start to go to, maybe a hot yoga class. We can start to get back into the gym, doing some lifting, some of those activities that make you sweat a little bit. Ideally, you still don't want your peak activity to be during this time, but you can definitely ramp up to, let's say, what one would call their normal activity level. So if their normal activity level is going out and hiking 9 miles 3 times a week, living in Boulder, Colorado or something, then they should be able to do that with comfort during that time. But they'll save their, big hike, their 20-mile long weekend hike for a different season in the menstrual cycle. So let's talk about ovulation. Days 12 to 16, approximately. During this time, we're going to see luteinizing hormone LH surge. We're going to see the basal body temperature dip down and then increase. The egg is going to be released from the ovary, okay? The cervix is going to start to soften. Cervical mucus is also going to thin, so it's going to be like the consistency of egg whites. This is so that the sperm can easily pass through and fertilize the egg. Now, during this time, the Chinese medicine philosophy is really such that we want qi and blood to be moving. There's going to be a lot of energy in the system, so we want to use pungent foods to help us move that qi and blood on a dietary level, and we want to strengthen the yang. So this means this is our time for vigorous exercise. Obviously, if one is trying to get pregnant, that, there's some exceptions here, but this is the time to do that super long hike. This is the time in one cycle, if they're going to be doing a triathlon or a marathon, something like that, this is the moment to do it. And then we want to encourage that creative output, that manifestation and expression, right? Because the egg serves as that. When the egg is unfertilized, we're not producing a child, but utilizing that energy of creation, that energy of manifestation, that energy of expression, encouraging our clients to get into that slipstream is so important for their spirit during this phase, for them to stay on the path of their Tao. The final phase we're going to talk about, phase 4, the luteal phase, days 17 to 28. So this is when progesterone is going to increase. Estrogen is high, and the uterine lining thickens. The Chinese medicine philosophy here is that we need to boost qi and yang. So we can get into this phase of vigorous and competitive exercise until about day 26, leading right up to the bleed, because we don't want to be utilizing all the energy we've got and then bleed the next day, ideally. So eating lots of veggies to increase fiber, and of course, starting that heavy increase in hydration is really, really important during this phase. I wanted to post this image of the balance between yin and yang. So we see when we start off with the menstruation phase on the bottom of the chart there, we start off with menstruation, go into the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. Of course, we're going to see the red line is yang, the blue line is yin. Now, we're going to see that yin and yang rise in correlation and coordination with each other. Yang becomes yin during menstruation, and yin becomes yang during ovulation. The seasons within. Okay, so let's think about that phase 1, that menstrual phase. This is going to be our inner winter. This is a phase where we have blood, we have the element of water, which makes sense, and the seeds or the essence are where we return to. In the spring, our follicular phase, we're going to have the fluid of yin, the element of wood, and we're going to start to see those buds form. During our inner summer, we're going to have ovulation. This is when yang is building. We have that fire energy, right? And of course, the flowers are blooming. In the autumn, the luteal phase, we've got the qi. We've got the metal element. And then we've got those petals starting to shed, right? And of course, earth sort of remains as the element in between. So just like it does in the seasons when we don't know if it's winter or spring, well, that's earth. When it's an equinox, that's earth, right? When things are harmonious or we can't quite tell what they are, that's that earth element coming in to kind of provide that balance and totality. I love explaining a menstrual cycle to clients through the lens of the seasons because it really gives them like that aha moment, that fresh breath of like, oh, it's okay that I feel this way, right? Okay, so let's talk about the hormones. First off, estrogen. Estrogen is going to peak in the days just before ovulation. It is made in the ovaries and it is secreted by the adrenals as well as the adipose tissue. It thins the cervical mucus. This keeps the walls of the vagina thick and elastic and also lubricated. The estrogen is going to support a healthy libido. It's also going to regulate the metabolism of lipids and our cholesterol levels. So this is really important to consider as well. It stimulates cells to develop insulin to the muscles, which actually lowers blood sugar. So I'm putting some of these sort of effects of the hormones in that don't exactly have to do with menstruation, but they're things that we might commonly see with women that we're treating. So the connection between cholesterol and the connection between blood sugar. Okay, so estrogen also is known to improve muscle mass and strength. Again, makes total sense from Chinese philosophy as to why when the estrogen peaks that we are really able to start pushing ourselves with exercise, right? Promotes activity of the osteoblasts, and these are the cells that make bone. So this is important to consider, especially as women age. Finally, estrogen binds to the fibroblasts and supports collagen production. So if you start to put pieces together here, face, aging, collagen, menopause, right? It all comes together. And finally, estrogen is neuroprotective, which means it supports brain health. Let's talk about progesterone. It peaks after ovulation in the luteal phase. It is produced by the adrenal cortex and the ovaries. It is produced and secreted by the corpus luteum, and that's really that uterine lining. So a new corpus luteum is formed during each ovulation. Thickens the endometrium for fertilized egg to implant and grow, regulates bleeding during menstruation, prevents ovulation during pregnancy, prepares the mammary glands for lactation, that's important, and has a reciprocal relationship with thyroid hormone. So if you have a client that is having menstrual challenges and they've got a thyroid condition, there's a link there. And a place to start looking might be progesterone. Their Western physician may or may not know that there's a connection there, but it's an important one for us to be aware of and to know, especially if they have not had a blood panel done. Let's talk about LH, luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone surges to cause the egg release, peaking, of course, at ovulation. It is secreted from the pituitary gland, and it works alongside follicle-stimulating hormone, which makes sense. Causes the corpus luteum to produce more progesterone during that luteal phase. It plays an important role in sexual development as well as an important role in fertility. So some of the chromosomal disorders that result in sexual anomalies are related to luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone deficiencies during the embryonic development. Follicle-stimulating hormone. It is produced by the pituitary gland, works alongside luteinizing hormone, stimulates follicles on the ovary to grow and prepare the egg for ovulation, plays an important role in the sexual development and, of course, in fertility. So here's a chart. I actually really like this chart. Believe it or not, it is from Encyclopedia Britannica in 2013. But it is a great chart that shows the rise and fall of the hormones. It's another great tool to have in your clinic to be able to show clients what's going on with their cycle at any given time. Menstruation. In Chinese medicine, a harmonious cycle begins with the kidney supplying qi to the organ systems that produce the blood and lining of menstruation, while also filling the extraordinary vessels, which are essentially the reservoirs for the 5 vital substances. Once these vessels are full, then menstruation can begin. Healthy menstruation is pain-free with bright red blood and a moderate flow. Blood should be minimal. Blood clots should be minimal. Short cycles are generally caused by excess heat, whereas long cycles are generally caused by excess cold. So that's an important one to keep in mind. And to define a short cycle is going to be a cycle that is 26 days or less. Long cycle is going to be 32 days or more, depending on where you get your definition. But generally speaking, that's how we're going to look at the concept of what a short cycle is and what a long cycle is. So it's the totality from menstruation through ovulation. Let's talk about dysmenorrhea. So dysmenorrhea is painful menstruation, which can include menstruation. It can include pain in the abdomen, the pelvis, the lower back, even the thighs, before and or during menstruation. It is also often combined with a feeling of heaviness or pressure. And in severe cases, the pain can be correlated with nausea or vomiting. Okay, so primary dysmenorrhea is somewhat poorly understood, and it is usually linked to the excess production of prostaglandins, which cause the uterus to contract and shed its lining. That contraction is a bit of an over-contraction, which is why there's pain. Secondary dysmenorrhea is a diagnosis within the organ systems, such as endometriosis, fibroids, pelvic inflammatory disease, uterine lining growing into the wall of the uterus, and of course, stenosis of the cervix. The pain patterns that we usually see with dysmenorrhea are blood stagnation and qi stagnation. Now, blood stagnation is often going to have a sharp, localized, unrelenting pain. There's going to be commonly blood clots, and there will be relief with NSAIDs, right? So non-steroidal anti-inflammatories would cause relief because they're going to change the patency of the blood. Now with qi stagnation, this is usually going to be a dull, achy, widespread, diffuse type of pain. It's going to be relieved by pressure, massage, movement, and heat. Let's talk about irregular cycles, or chaotic menstruation, as they're often called in Chinese medicine. They are chaotic, inconsistent, and unpredictable. So the liver stores blood and the kidney stores essence, right? The combination moves qi and blood into the uterus and the extraordinary vessels. Thus, irregular cycles are essentially caused by either liver qi stagnation, kidney yin deficiency, or kidney yang deficiency. Liver qi stagnation is going to be marked by scanty, dark blood with clots and difficulty releasing the blood. Kidney yin deficiency is going to have a component of heat or empty heat. And kidney yang deficiency, of course, the opposite, is going to have that cold. Now, overwork can cause inconsistency in the filling of the vessels, right? Again, it's about the distribution of energy. There's only so much in the body. So that overwork, of course, as it affects the kidneys in many ways, it can certainly affect the kidneys in relation to how they move blood and qi into the uterus. Menorrhagia, excessive menstrual bleeding. This is defined as a heavy menstrual flow. Abnormal uterine bleeding, we have to define this separately, because that is spontaneous and out of cycle bleeding, and can also be considered flooding when we look at the Chinese medicine definition. So we're not going to talk about abnormal uterine bleeding today. We're going to stick to heavy menstruation, or menorrhagia. So this is often caused by spleen qi deficiency, or blood stagnation, or heat in the blood specifically. Now, qi deficiency is going to allude to the qi not being firm enough to hold the blood, right? So often we're going to see a combination of spleen qi deficiency here, or the spleen not controlling the blood with spleen qi deficiency, right? Blood stagnation is going to create an overfilling of the vessels and the uterus with no place for the blood to go. So it's a little bit of confusion in our mind when we think about this, because we say we have stagnation and an overfilling. But what happens essentially, if we think of this like a stream in a river, stream or a river, and there's lots of logs and leaves and stuff like that that's blocking it up. Well, that's stagnation, right? And also there's this overfilling. There's a seeping of the water into the land, into the space around that river or that stream, right? So that's essentially what we have going on when we've got blood stagnation. No place for the blood to go, it goes out the uterus. Then we've got heat in the blood. And this is essentially heat going to be agitating the blood and causing the blood to just not want to stay in the system. Finally, amenorrhea. This is the absence of menstruation. We've got primary and secondary. Primary, those assigned female at birth who have not menstruated by the age of 18 years old. Secondary, no cycle for 3 months or more at any age above 18. This is very often caused by dampness in the uterus. So spleen qi deficiency is often the cause here, creating poor transformation, thus obstruction of the lower jiao and the uterus, which then leads to a series of other problems in patterning, right? We essentially end up with qi and blood deficiency due to poor nourishment throughout the system, or qi and blood stagnation, which is more of an excess condition, and the blood is stagnant but not deficient. So what about menstruation and the pelvic floor? This is an important conversation, and one that I have very often with my clients and my students. So there are 3 components that we're going to talk about very, very briefly and basically. 1 is the muscles, 2 is inflammation, and 3 is pressure changes. Muscles. The changes in estrogen create changes in the muscle suppleness throughout the body, okay? This also occurs in the pelvic floor. So estrogen is the lowest when we are leading up to and during the monthly bleed, okay? So what this means is that the suppleness is at its minimal during this time. There's also an increase in prostaglandins, which further relaxes the smooth muscle tissue leading up to the shedding of the uterine lining. And of course, this shedding of the uterine lining creates a micro-inflammatory response, right? So now we've got muscles that are starting to be less supple. We've got inflammation And on top of that, progesterone increasing can slow digestion. Estrogen rising can cause gas and air to be trapped within the intestines, which means we have pressure changes. So we have some slack muscles, we have inflammation, and we have pressure changes. All of this means that leading up to one's bleed and during one's bleed, they can experience increased urinary and bowel incontinence, urinary and bowel frequency, urinary and bowel urgency, loose stools, of course, abdominal distension, and pain leading up to the cycle and during the cycle. The pelvic floor is directly impacted by what's happening with the hormones leading up to and during menstruation. Now, why is this important for us to know? Well, one, when we're questioning our clients, when we're asking them about their cycle, when we're asking them about their pelvic floor and the function of their pelvic floor, it's important for us to know, is the pelvic floor, let's say, weak or tight all the time? Or is the pelvic floor just at a disadvantage, a hormonal disadvantage, let's say, when they are leading up to their cycle? Now, as acupuncturists, we have a brilliant gift of connecting with our clients and understanding a little bit about their bodies on both a Western and an energetic level. We also have this great tool in our toolkit called acupuncture. And what does acupuncture do? It creates a neuroendocrine effect. So great news about that. We can understand hormones, but we don't have to totally understand hormones to make a difference within the body, because if we understand the pattern and we're inserting needles into the body, we're going to elicit a neuroendocrine effect. What does a neuroendocrine effect do? It balances the hormones in the body system. So we can really make a big impact. And I honestly see a lot of clients that have pelvic floor dysfunction specific to menstruation have a major improvement just from having general acupuncture that isn't specific to the pelvic floor. It's such an amazing benefit. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such an honor to have you with me for this workshop. I want to again take a moment to thank the AAC, the American Acupuncture Council, for hosting this video. If you don't already know, I have recorded a pelvic floor intro, and coming soon, you'll have the opportunity to watch my fertility, pregnancy, postpartum, and menopause videos in relation to the pelvic floor. And again, thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to look at my references, go ahead and just pause this slide. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks to the AAC.